welcome to the Integration Station. I'm Michael, a child and adolescent occupational therapist, and with me today...
And I'm Eleanor. I am also a child and adolescent occupational therapist.
And she's also the clinical director at OTFC Group, so thank you for coming on again, Eleanor.
Thank you for having me.
So as normal, we will go through a whole range of topics, supporting the young people in our lives and finding the fun and learning these things. We'll take your questions, throw in some of our own, and hopefully find some insight through these conversations.
Sounds good.
Yeah, and if you want to reach us, you can via email. We've got some emails, which is great. Thank you for using the old-fashioned way of communicating. Otherwise, Instagram. Had a few questions from Instagram, those which we'll get through today. And that's about it.
Sounds good.
Plenty of ways to reach out. So today's agenda, I think there's a bit of discussion around sensory tools and toys, which was covered a little bit in one of our previous episodes. So great to just tie that up a bit more. Discussion about low demand language, which I know you're quite interested in. But we might kick off with a question about global developmental delay. So does a global developmental delay always mean it will progress into another diagnosis? So that's an interesting question for me. Did you have some thoughts on it?
Well, perhaps before we kind of launch into it, we can chat a little bit about what that actually means, global developmental delay. And I recognise in saying this, I guess when it comes to global developmental delay, there is a specific criteria that a paediatrician, for example, might be utilising to observe how that young person is progressing in line with others their age. We're looking at things like speech and language milestones, gross and fine motor skills, social and play skill development. But it's hard, isn't it, when it's got quite that specific criteria. It's developing at their own rate, in their own time, in their own way, with differences as part of that. But I guess importantly, it's just helping to provide a marker with the tools that we have available at the moment about what that development is looking like, recognising where those strengths are, but importantly, where potentially some therapeutic supports might be able to assist in further exploring that.
Yeah, and you mentioned that that's a diagnostic process. So for developmental delay, there's usually at least in two areas of development. So that could be social skills or communication, could be motor skills, fine and gross motor skills, could be cognitive skills. So any of those areas, if there's a delay in two of those, then that sort of meets the criteria there.
And so our listener wanted to know whether that always progresses to another diagnosis. And I think it is very dependent. I would say not always, but certainly in those earlier ages, that could be a way of understanding where they're at that point in time, which may become part of a bigger picture, a broader umbrella diagnosis as they progress and grow. So whilst it's not always the case, I do find that there are some circumstances where that does lead to a more holistic understanding as they grow older.
I think one of the biggest things I note is that if there's a global delay with, say, cognitive capacity that may be lower than what's considered, the developmental level of that child, then that often does lead to a more significant, more developmental delay being lifelong or longer term, and another diagnosis, say, such as an intellectual disability. And that's where, as you said at the start, having pediatricians, having psychologists, having professionals who are able to diagnose or able to identify that, come in, provide that information. But I think that's one part of it. You're absolutely right. There's a holistic way of doing it as well, to understand that. And I'm very much a believer of, regardless of diagnoses and labels or however you want to term it, that you're working with the strengths and challenges of that young person. So we have to spend time identifying what the areas are that need the most support, focus on those, but also not losing sight of the strengths of that young person.
Yeah, I think that's very much how we operate. And importantly, it's just an opportunity to access some of those therapeutic supports with that understanding in place and have some really targeted goals in what that can look like.
One thing I'd say is we or at OTFC, but generally the sensory integration theory and practice very much stemmed from those children that fell through the gaps.
Yeah, so true.
So they were the ones that maybe presented with whether it was motor delays or speech delays or, dyspraxia. And I think there was another question coming up and we might discuss later about dyspraxia, but those young people that didn't necessarily meet other diagnoses. And that's where I think things like global delay can help form a bit of a how can you say, almost like this is where that person is at. Now, I'm also a believer that developmental milestones are there for a reason, but they shouldn't always be the be all and end all. Everyone develops in their own time. But what a diagnosis such as global developmental delay or developmental delays in general help with is provide maybe a foundation or a bit of an understanding for that family or for the person working with that young person about, okay, this is where they're at compared to what would be considered age appropriate, if you will. And this is how we can support them to build their skills. And they have their own baseline and we help build them towards that. And so sensory integration very much understood that this person is having challenges in particular areas and we want to support them to be more fluid or more able to do the things they want to do.
Yeah.
So for developmental delay, if it's, motor skills, if it's speech and language, if it's something along those lines, then there is every chance that those things will improve. And even with more significant diagnoses that might come along the line, such as autism, with cognitive delays, there is still progress that can happen through the right therapy. And that's the whole point of early intervention.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think having that understanding at a young age can then support access to those early intervention opportunities, which is brilliant. So I think circling back to the original question, does that always lead to another diagnosis? No, but that certainly is a potential and it's just very dependent on that young person and their needs.
Yeah, case by case.
What that developmental profile looks like for them.
Okay, I have another one for you, Eleanor. Do you recommend any fidget toys or things for kids with sensory issues? Now, I know we discussed this in a previous episode, so for that person sending in the question, feel free to go through our back catalogue and have a listen to that. I think it was a couple of weeks ago. But initially, fidget toys or any things in particular, what's your, if you're recommending something, what's your go-to? Or is it?
Admittedly, fidget toys aren't necessarily the first thing that I go for. I think they obviously serve a purpose, whether it's that tactile input, if it's something squishy or it feels a little bit different, a little bit of movement, something to flick and play with whilst they're listening and doing other things. But the whole point of some of these sensory strategies is to tailor that to that person's unique needs and preferences. And I think what potentially happened was because it worked for some young people, it started to be used a little bit more broadly. And then it became this understanding that, well, if someone needs something to help them listen or a movement break, give them a fidget and that's going to help fix everything, when that's not actually the case, especially when there are some of those fidget toys can be quite visually stimulating or they might make a little bit of noise when they're being used. And so then it shifts from becoming something used for regulation and focus to something that can be distracting, whether it's for that young person or for others. And so I think it is very individual and it depends on what that person's needs are, but then also what it looks like for the class. Having said that, I don't think that they should not be used. And if it works for that person, then how can we implement that in a way that works for them as well as the class? What do you think?
No, well, I was interesting. On the drive over here this morning, I don't know why, I was thinking about this concept of, I was listening to a podcast and they were talking about, it was a psychologist talking about schools and school systems and tailoring learning for that individual child and how they present. And I know we sort of discussed that a little bit in one of our previous episodes as well. But part of me thought, okay, if we're providing what is considered best practice for some of these people, and there's a whole range of randomized control trials and you do all these tests and all this stuff, then that's great. I can understand that. But if the fundamental point of supporting someone, particularly if they're neurodivergent, is to make it so individualized and bespoke for that individual, then a randomized control trial doesn't work.
No.
Because you can't extrapolate that data, that information for that individual person. Now, some of the things might work, but it doesn't mean that everything you're doing is going to work for that person. So the best approach is to really hone in and get to know that person and understand what they need. And I think this is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, for sure.
Fidget toys are really useful, but you're right. Like, I would find something useful, but you might not find it very useful at all. Or I find it distracting, but you find it regulating. And it comes back to the bigger point about what is the benefit of a fidget toy? What are they designed to be? Like, what is the purpose? And I think the purpose of a fidget toy is to act as like an intermediary, or almost like, like a piece of chewing gum, which can be considered a fidget toy if you want to, in between doing some of the bigger stuff that's helping keep you regulated. The whole point is to try and keep you regulated.
Yeah.
Right? And if fidget toys do that, great. But if it means that someone else is going to be dysregulated by that, then we have to find something that works.
Yeah.
Particularly in a classroom space. But if it's you individually and you're finding this sensory toy works really well for you, great. There's no research that says that, flicking a rubber band around your finger, or like I do, I have a pen and I flick the lid up and down.
Yeah, me too.
That costs no money at all. It's not a fidget toy that has been designed for multiple purposes. It serves a purpose for regulation. It serves a purpose in its own way. And all I can say is that if that works for that person, then that is fine.
I think, like what you always say, it's not a problem if it's not a problem. And it's so interesting what you said about the pen. I think as adults, we probably don't even realise the little things that we've brought into our own practices that help us regulate. And I'm using the word regulate because we're very aware of what that needs to look like. But I think so many of us wouldn't even notice or cue in with that's what we're doing. We have swipe cards that help us get around to the different areas at our site at Parkside. And I'm always tapping it or spinning it in my hand. And I think sometimes, I've made my own fidget from the card, with the idea being that's just helping me keep present and focused with what I'm doing. And that those little things work really well for me.
So I think in answer to the question, do I recommend anything? Yes, I recommend watching what your child does and watching how you can then either transfer that to something in, say, a classroom space, or allow them to use those things when you're at home, as long as it's not breaking stuff all the time. But you know what I mean? Like, there's obviously things that you can do that they are giving you, and it comes back to, we talked about a few episodes ago about behaviors and picking up on the cues of that young person to go, okay, they're giving me insight into what they're using that for. How can I then make that more purposeful for them? Because then that's ultimately teaching regulation tools as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's some classrooms that potentially maybe teachers have not had such a positive experience with fidget toys in the past, or they've found it to be more of a distraction than it is supportive. And so they might have some rules and expectations about fidget toys, or that's not something that's accessible in that space. And I can actually totally understand how they might have reached that point too, if it hasn't been helpful for some of those young person's needs. But I think exactly like you said, it just is very dependent on the person, but almost having a little bit of an agreement about how they could be used. So getting that young person involved to go, of course, you can access this, but we're also going to implement these other opportunities so that you can get that big movement input, like you said. But also, if we have this agreement that I have the chance to check in with you, and we might implement other things to make sure that I can keep the rest of the class on track as well. But some of those more subtle ones are really good, like the rubber band around.
I love it.
That's
what I recommend for like high school kids, is like rubber bands, blue tack, anything that, if you're a 14, 15-year-old and you are needing to fidget with your hands or do something, you're not going to want to have a fidget toy in your hand in front of a whole bunch of other kids. You're not going to want to have a chewy toy in your mouth in front of a whole bunch of other kids. I understand chewing gum was taken out of schools because half of it ended up under a table. And my school definitely was like that. But at the same time, there are a whole bunch of kids that if you put things in place, and I have certainly explained this to families and to teachers, if you have parameters in place and expectations about how, say, gum can be used, it is a very regulating thing for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know there are obviously concerns for some people who have, dental challenges or too much chewing and the impact on the joints of the mouth, and I won't go into the details on that, but that can be a real thing. But if it's done in the right way, that's a good example of a really versatile sense.
Actually, a family gave me the example once of, the lanyards that you can wear around your neck that have the retractable, I can't remember.
I got one on my hip.
Yeah, they had that around their neck, and they would have maybe the keys for their locker attached to that so they could pull that at times. Or it's interesting what you said about the chewing gum underneath the table. One that I often like too is a little bit of the scratchy piece of the Velcro stuck on the backside so that you can run your fingers over it underneath the table while you're listening.
So on the backside of the table, not your backside.
No, not on the backside. Do you know what's so funny? As I said that,
and
it
came out.
Michael's going to say something about that. But yes, on the underneath of the table, shall I say instead?
That's good.
I'm glad you pulled me up on that though. That's good.
Fine. Yeah, all good. So yeah, I think it comes back to everyday stuff can be really useful. And look, I'm not saying that there aren't fantastic sensory tools and toys out there. Like I know some people say fidget spinners are shocking and they've got nothing. I know some people that love fidget spinners and it works for them. Fine. I think it comes back to whatever works for that person and whatever they can use, as long as it's supporting their regulation and doesn't become a significant distraction.
Absolutely.
Or distraction for others in the class.
And don't just put it in place to say, well, movement's been recommended or give them a fidget toy. Is that actually going to be supportive for that person? Or is that not meeting their needs? And then you kind of end up just in a place that's even trickier than where you were because that's not been supportive for them.
I have one more question for you, Eleanor, and I know that you have spent a bit of time talking about this stuff on our socials, and it's about low demand language. And the question is, can you please make some videos of what we can be doing better in schools to support our kids? So we're not doing a video, unfortunately. Instead, we're going to discuss
we could do, though.
Well, you have.
Yeah.
You have. But in terms of talking about how we do that in schools, I thought a good way to start is to maybe discuss that on this podcast and have a bit more of a conversation around what low demand language is, and then maybe how that can be transferred to the school environment, which, my opinion, I'll get yours on it. I think there are actually a lot of similarities to what you can do at home as to what you can do in the classroom. But take it away. Yeah,
for sure. And when we talk about low demand language, I guess what we're trying to do is provide a statement, an instruction, a request in a way that doesn't feel like so much of a demand. When I'm talking about demands, I mean things like, you might ask someone directly to do something, but there's so many indirect demands as well. Social expectations, steps within routines, demands within demands, that kind of thing. There's also some of those internal ones, your body telling you to do different things or an excitement that you're feeling about doing something, and then that becomes a demand too. And this is probably something that we can delve into a little bit more in depth in another podcast. Plus, I also feel like I could just talk about this forever.
You probably could.
But it's just something I feel very passionately about, and I feel like I've learned so much from the incredible young people that I work with that have, whether it's that anxiety response that they're managing, that demands can really trigger. And sometimes that's associated with neurodevelopmental differences and neurodivergent profiles. Sometimes that might be associated with something like a pathological demand avoidant profile or PDA. But I find myself recognizing all of the demands that we all have to manage across our day as adults, as young people. And the idea with low demand language is still presenting those opportunities, but in a way that feels less triggering, so that young person ultimately almost has the choice to engage, or it feels like less of a threat, a perception of a threat.
So what I hear throughout that is that the perception from that young person about something that's being said might be perceived as a direct, it could be perceived as a threat, or it could be perceived as something that is more than just what is considered an instruction by the adult or a caregiver. And in this case, a teacher might be just saying, I would just like you to, pack up the books on your table.
Absolutely.
And that may be perceived as a threat, or it may be perceived as something beyond what that person is capable of doing in that moment, or has the capacity to do in that moment.
Yeah. I think the reason we're using the word threat in this instant, I suppose, is because actually for some young people who do manage considerable difficulties in meeting these demands is because that their body is having an anxiety-based nervous system response, is activating that fight, flight, fawn, freeze, whatever that might look like for them, because they're kicking into survival mode. And we think sometimes, imagine being asked to do something and it's seemingly, innocuous, or it's a routine thing that's required, or it seems like a really simple thing to request. But for that young person, they feel like a moment of choice or control is not available there for them. And that can be really tricky to then be able to meet what's being asked. So we use low demand language as I mentioned, with the idea of providing choice. I know that might make it sound like, well, what if they say no? Which is a potential from this.
Yeah.
But it's also honouring their authentic self and their capacity to make some of those choices. So it's, I guess, saying, rather than saying it's time to, I think the example we used in the video, put your shoes on, or it's time to go. It's just saying something like, I wonder if we can get our shoes and socks. So then they have the opportunity to then make that choice to engage. And sometimes when we do give those moments of control, they're able to then make that decision in line with what we're expecting as well.
One thing I have had feedback about, or I've anecdotally heard, is that doing that, and this is the only thing, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it, is sometimes not being as clear as put your shoes on. And so using different words to go around what you want them to do might come across as confusing, or might mean that person then has to interpret what's actually being asked.
Yeah.
I obviously don't necessarily think that, and I'm assuming you're going to say the same, but what do you think, or if a parent is thinking that or a teacher is thinking that, what could be the way to explain to them that, okay, this is why, or this is how you might do it, and how it's not being unclear?
And I think if I think about someone that maybe has communication differences, that adding in lots of extra words, that's going to make things even trickier for them as well. I think you have to be really conscious of the young person that you're engaging with. The audience, for sure, to make sure that actually what you're offering is in line with what they're needing.
Sure.
And not introducing extra words for the sake of it, because then that's going to lead to confusion as well, and potentially refusal because they're not sure. But sometimes something like those AA choices come in really well there, I think. So if it is something being really clear of it's time to put your shoes on, then offering a moment of, should we do a quick race up the hallway first, or have a cuddle before we put shoes, or are you feeling ready? So then they're actioning what they need to, but then they still have choice about what it looks like.
Yeah. And at the end, the shoes will get put on, or that person knows that, okay, there is still a option to put shoes on, but I have some control over when that happens.
Exactly. And I think sometimes when it's that really thinking about a school space where quite possibly you are managing more of those really direct demands and expectations, because you'll have classroom settings, things that you have to get done. There's tasks that the whole class needs to do. And at each point you might be saying to them, it's time to do this, or, it's kind of eyes on the front. I need you listening to me, even though that's probably another topic altogether. Are they actually listening? No. But I guess some key things, if I was breaking this down in terms of low demand language and how you might incorporate that, a parent's explained this once to me and I found it really helpful. Am I going down the path of providing autonomy with some of that indirect language, AA choices, things like that, moments of choice and control? Or am I going down with the equality side of things, where this isn't my expectation for you personally, it's the expectation or the routine for everyone? And then that potentially then shifts some of that demand as well, where it's not, I need you to do this. It's more, it's time for us to do this as a class. Do you feel ready to start? Or should we do a quick 10-minute movement break first?
Yeah. There's one book that I actually like. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a book by a speech pathologist called Linda K. Murphy. She wrote a book about declarative language.
Okay.
Really, it's the declarative language handbook. And in there, she, for any parent or teacher, I find it's like only about 80, 90 words. Pages. 80, 90 words. That'd be very clear. But it is a really nice practical way of breaking down some of the differences between what's declarative and what's imperative language. And that's essentially where some of that low demand language comes from, is that you're giving you need to do this, an imperative thing, and the declarative, I've noticed, or what do you think we could, changing that language to really provide that more autonomy. And I mean, obviously makes sense. It comes from a speech pathologist because it's about words and how you give those words. But it does provide some really nice strategies and some examples, and a really useful tool for anybody that might be looking for a bit of advice there as well. Do
you know what I think would just be so hard for a young person too, where especially a school-based one, where we're starting to learn more of ourselves and the way that we experience and interact with the world, and we're starting to build our voice and understanding of what that looks like, and then coming into an environment potentially where it's maybe I'm being asked to do things quite consistently, or I feel like that voice might get a little lost in amongst everything else that's happening. And at each point, I'm really trying to do my best, and I want to do well. I want to do what's being asked, and I'm looking around the room and I'm trying to keep up with what everyone else is doing too. But at each point, I'm feeling like that I can't honor that voice. And then I think, like we've spoken to in a previous podcast, then we come home and everything comes out. And quite possibly it is meeting those demands really consistently and working super hard to do that. That's contributing to that. So even for a young person that can be seemingly compliant, I think there's opportunity here to then make it that they're not working as hard to do that.
And working hard means a lot of effort and a lot more emotions and a lot of other things that happen in the day. So certainly for a teacher, there's a lot going on in the class. I get it. There are a lot more needs in classes these days. But coming back to maybe some of the language that's used, I think there are a few things in there we discussed. And even before some of the other stuff about sensory toys, I think all this stuff definitely within a classroom space, how we support someone just comes down to, can we do this as individually as possible? Can we think about this young person? And if there's one thing from this episode I could sum up, it's if we're treating each individual as themselves, then you will talk to them how their best information to deliver to them. You will provide the sensory toys that they need. And in doing so, you're probably going to get the best level of trust from that person as well. So
I love that, Michael.
Some great questions. And I think you mentioned we should do a full podcast on PDA or low demand language or even low demand parenting. I mean, that's another thing in itself. Yeah. And I think we can maybe look at that. But for now, I think that's about all for today. Yeah,
that sounds really good.
Do one last shout out to Fletch if he's listening. Hopefully he is. Good night, good morning, good evening. And if you do want to submit a question, podcast@otfcgroup.au. Otherwise on the socials at Instagram as well. So thank you and we'll see you next time.
See you next time. Thanks, Michael.